Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Steve Orlins, President of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. I trust you are all safe and healthy in this extremely challenging time. With what is going on in U.S.-China relations, we at the committee strongly believe that our mission is more important than ever. So today we're beginning a series of webinars entitled Navigating China's Technological Rise. This series stems from an in-person symposium that we plan to hold at the end of this month in Silicon Valley. While COVID-19 prevents us from holding this program in person, there's actually a silver lining in this dark, very dark cloud. By migrating the program online, we're able to reach a broader audience from coast to coast. The participants who would have attended this program in person are in the Zoom webinar. At the same time, we're opening these discussions to the entire National Committee community, many of whom are watching the live stream on our website, so they can also benefit from this important discussion. The next session will be held on May 8th and feature a discussion between Anya Manuel and Paul Triolo about technology regulation and its industry impact. We're of course thrilled to have Admiral Dennis Blair kick off our series. You have his distinguished record, so let me just list 4 highlights. First, after becoming a 4-star, he commanded our Pacific Command. He then later, after his retirement from the Navy, became Director of National Intelligence, where he led America's 16 national intelligence agencies. He is currently the first not distinguished visiting professor of practice at University of North Carolina, a member of the board of the National Committee, and head of the committee's Track 2 dialogue on digital economy issues. Denny, I can't thank you enough for your service to our country and for your friendship to both me and the committee. Welcome and kick it off.
Well, great, Steve. Thanks very much for the warm welcome and for coming up with a novel new way to continue the committee's mission when times are tough. Taking a look at the list of participants, I see many friends from the committee. I see others who probably know as much or more than I do about this subject. So I want to turn this into a conversation as quickly as possible, but let me start out with a few comments just to try to set the context. I think it's worth taking a quick look at how we got to this point. After all, back in 1989, when China opened up, I think most observers thought that China would follow that same trajectory we had seen for many Asian countries, that they would start out with relatively low-tech industries, but would gradually work up the value chain, would develop very good companies, would in fact become international competitors to American companies. And there were some bumps along the way, of course, with Japan, with Korea, with other countries. So it wasn't as if this was not known and recognized as we dealt with China in those years. But what were the differences? Why didn't China follow this comfortable course, and why are we where we are today? I think the first factor is that the scale of China is just so huge. It was hard to comprehend how an economy that big, following basically the same path that other smaller economies had followed, would be different. I know that 10 years ago, every company executive that I talked with believed that his company simply had to be in the China market to grow. It was a requirement. And as we are learning now, this is probably more of a wish and an ambition than a necessity, but it nonetheless was prevalent. And this belief, I think, softened strong opposition to Chinese requirements like local partners with majority partnership, transfer of intellectual property, and even toleration of outright IP theft under the policy of indigenous innovation. I think another factor 15 years ago was that the general idea was still that China as it became more prosperous, would ease off some of its mercantilist practices. Some sectors would remain protected as they were in many countries, but many others would be open to foreign companies. Initial regulations to protect domestic companies would ease in those sectors. Chinese companies would certainly develop that would be advanced, fierce competitors, but there would be plenty of business to go around. And then finally, I think third assumption, was that the security relations between China and the rest of the world would remain relatively calm and quiet. So as I tick through these 3 points, I think they quickly bring up some of the differences between the Chinese development and the development that we saw from other Asian countries earlier. The size of the Chinese market meant that the American business community and the economic officials of the United States, heeding their urgings, tended to give China the benefit of the doubt for many, many years. And in addition, of course, there were and there still are many American companies doing profitable business in China: insurance companies, car companies, links in the supply chain of chemical companies, electronic companies, many others. Why change policies when there are a good number of American companies who are doing just fine? But this expected favorable change that was really, I think, built into American expectations about Chinese policies concerning foreign business have not materialized. In fact, some have gone the wrong direction. Executives of companies I know who felt that things were going the right direction are now seeing themselves being pressured in new ways doing business in China. And most notably, China's sights have raised in the most advanced and important technologies of the future, and China has decided that it will use all means at its disposal to favor Chinese national champions in these sectors. And these are sectors in which the United States, other advanced Western companies have a traditional advantage. And so China, having made this decision, it continues to use its domestic market policies for its own purposes to favor Chinese companies. It continues to exploit things like overseas education of its scientists and executives, as well as IP theft by human and digital means as a means of technology transfer. And it has put a sharp competitive edge, zero-sum thinking in the economic realm, which previously had much more of a win-win mentality in it, I would say, between the United States and China. And of course, the geopolitical relationship has become very competitive, and that bleeds over into economic and business. So I may have missed a few big factors here, and I'd love to hear them, but I think few would argue with this overall direction of U.S.-China economic relations, which has generally gone in a different direction from America's expectations and hopes that's several years back. But most important, what can be done? I really think most of the heavy lifting has to be done by the American government, but with the strong support of the business community. I know many of you on this call work with or for companies that are doing business in China. I know that you developed approaches to take advantage of the opportunities, minimize the risks of operations there. You make individual gain-loss decisions, what technologies to bring into China, what Chinese partners to work with, what government regulatory bodies can be counted on, what parts of the Chinese legal system will give foreign companies a hearing, how individual Chinese employees can be trusted or watched if not trusted. So there will always be US companies that will operate in China, and they will be making money there. That's why they'll be there. But I think where the United States must raise its game is at the government level, and I would point to four areas. I'd say the first one is enforcement, or the negative side of it. Based on the work done in the Intellectual Property Commission that I co-chaired with John Huntsman a number of years ago, I believe we have to develop a system to punish Chinese companies, the companies that profit from IP theft, through rapid administrative procedures. The effective punishments are denial of the US market for finance, for export, for any purposes, and the speed can be achieved by changing the burden of proof from the victim to the perpetrator, so we don't have these two-year lags. I think these enforcement standards have to be consistent so that Chinese companies that do follow the rules, do not steal intellectual property, are free to operate in the United States. And I think the National Committee has been good in supporting many of these companies. Second, industrial policy. And I'd say, yes, the United States does need government policies that will support our companies when they're at an obvious short-term disadvantage from Chinese mercantilist practices. We don't want a command economy over the long term for all of the obvious reasons of stifling innovation and entrepreneurships. However, when China is subsidizing its companies in an important sector and the effects are to destroy American companies in the short term, then the US government needs a process to step in, and it needs a process to step out. Lithium-ion batteries, for example, are becoming a strategic commodity of the future. China's building most of the factories, cornering the market on most of the supplies that go into these factories for the world battery market. And the United States needs a government-led action to support a domestic lithium-ion battery sector. 5G wireless communications are one of the most important critical infrastructures of the future. In addition to squeezing Chinese companies out of the US market, which is what the US government is spending most of its time doing and trying to do it in other markets, in cooperation with allies, we need to support non-Chinese business consortia that can provide end-to-end 5G systems of high quality and at a reasonable price. And we need to insist on reciprocity there. Third, research and development, the third area. For a variety of reasons, American government and business investment in R&D has sunk to the lowest level in decades. Meanwhile, American companies are sitting on cash and buying back shares. The United States simply must raise its R&D spending. If we can't think of better ideas, we should impose a corporate surcharge and plow it right back into university and laboratory research with publicly available results. It must be the United States that comes up with the next generation of energy storage devices beyond lithium-ion batteries. It must be the United States that comes up with 6G and 7G technology, and we won't do it if at the current level of R&D spending. And then fourth and last, international cooperation. In dealing with China, the United States would be far more effective if it coordinated its priorities and its approaches with European allies, Japan, Korea, other like-minded countries. As a small example, all of us need to show up at the international standard setting bodies that the Chinese make a point of attending in large numbers. I was reminded of this just 2 weeks ago when I received an email from a friend who was the only American on an ITU, International Telecommunications Union International Teleconference on future 5G standards. There were 10 Chinese on the call. We can't expect to have standards go our way unless we show up and make the right arguments. So those would be four things that I would suggest, but I really welcome comments and questions from others. And back to you, Steve.
Great. I mean, I think those four areas are you know, they're kind of must-dos. I mean, no question we should be kind of following those suggestions. Talk about how COVID-19 has affected the way you're thinking about China's technological rise.
I think my main reaction to COVID-19 is really more disappointment with the American international performance than it is criticism of the Chinese performance. Traditionally, the United States, when there's been a world crisis, has been the one to step forward, rally the troops, lead the effort to do the right thing for everybody, which yes, does include the right thing for the United States, but not to an extreme point of view. Sets the example of sharing technology, looking for best technology from others, sort of fostering that exchange of technology for the benefit of everyone that's so powerful for the United States position and helps the world. And I've just been disappointed in this sort of in this America first. Well, it's not even an America first; it's America only approach that we have taken, and I think it has undercut our ability to lead the sort of international effort, which is, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, I think is a key to success.
What about, I mean, it actually goes to our first question, which is asked by Andy Rothman. You know, some in Washington have been suggesting that the Chinese government may have after after the January 23rd Wuhan lockdown, deliberately covered up information about the coronavirus and that the virus may have escaped from a lab in Wuhan. Based on your experience, do you think if the USG had compelling evidence of a cover-up or a lab accident, that evidence would have been made public by now, which relates to kind of the trust and the technological competition?
I mean, I've been to Chinese laboratories, I've been to Chinese street markets, and if I had to lay my money on where the coronavirus came from, I'd choose the street market every time. I think that's just a much more likely source. So I think that wherever it came from, the Chinese response to cover up, to punish the doctors and all has been pretty typical and recognized, and the subsequent Chinese effort of donation diplomacy and sending a bill later and so on has been pretty transparent. So I think that China probably comes out neutral or a little negative on this thing in the long term. As I said, I think the United States had an opportunity to sort of reestablish the sort of not being the only power, but sort of leading the posse, which has been our traditional role, and we miss that point. Now, if there is smoking gun evidence that China did more than just try to suppress those doctors who knew what was going on, moving forward. If there was something more diabolical and sinister than that, then I think that there's an international case to be made for really clamping down on China in serious ways. But really, I think that, as many people have said, that's sort of for the future. The main thing now is to get through what we have.
The technological competition, kind of the strategic competition that we talk about all the time, has led to kind of us being unwilling to cooperate with the Chinese on technological development. Much more than Huawei, it was the reduction of CDC personnel in China from 2017, when they had around 40, to 2019, when it was down to 11, including the reduction of the elimination of the epidemiologist who we had in the embassy. So that position was eliminated basically because of this strategic competition. And the Chinese, because of this strategic competition and this fear of technological cooperation, wouldn't allow American experts into China early on. So whatever went on, they didn't allow CDC personnel and other American experts until two, I think, were in the WHO delegation, which was weeks after the epidemic started. So do we understate the dangers of kind of this creation of two ecosystems?
It's pretty clear that the Chinese professionals, the doctors, the researchers and all, wanted to get the word out. They knew, and I don't know if they were thinking about the danger to other Chinese or they were thinking danger around the world. I mean, people who deal with epidemics and pandemics are generally pretty well plugged in internationally, and I think they think in terms of global dangers, which we've seen from virtually all the pandemics in the past. So I think the underlying scientific impulse of those who knew what they were doing in China was probably noble, fine. This government policy, I mean, I think it was probably based more on the traditional, don't send bad news to the emperor, don't take care of it locally, don't let it get big. We don't want this to soil reputations and hurt people. So I interpret most of it as just this this complete desire to control the message in every way that has been exacerbated in recent years under President Xi, who seems to carry it to a whole new level. So I would attribute it to that rather than some diabolical Chinese scheme to you know, let infected people get on airplanes and go infect the rest of the world. I mean, given a choice between a simple explanation based on preternatural behavior and some diabolical conspiracy, I sort of always choose number one for big governments, and I don't think China's any exception. So I think they are reaping the the bad results of this insistence on control and owning the message and owning individuals that they have established a system to enforce.
Yeah, I agree. How do you account for like the successes of Apple, IBM, some of the technology companies? Obviously, Google, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter have been totally blocked. Microsoft has had some success, but its cloud service is not allowed. So how do you kind of account for the difference in the success rate?
It was interesting when John Huntsman and I did this study on intellectual property theft. We went around and talked to most of those companies, and what we found was that each one had sort of arranged a different set of contacts and working relations and cooperative relationships in China. And what struck us was that they felt that they would try to individually find a Chinese government official who would be their go-to person if something happened, and get that person to come down from a high level and change it. They would sort of strike a bargain with Chinese regulators about a certain sector in which it was to China's advantage for them to operate, and from the company's advantage to be able to make money. They looked at their technology specifically, and they would decide which part could go to China, knowing that it would probably be compromised. So what I think the answer is to the different experience of different IT companies in China is that each one sort of went in differently on its own approach, and China looked at them individually and said, "Okay, I'll take I'd like to take a Microsoft server farm. I'd like to take an Apple assembly plant. I'd like to take and so it was a very completely transactional set of relationships between the big American IT companies on the one hand and the Chinese government on the other hand. The Chinese government, I don't think, was completely unified there. I don't think it was one office that made this master plan. I think they basically reacted, and a wide range of Chinese officials made decisions. And then each one had a different experience. I mean, when the big Google exfiltration back in 1999, that when they moved their servers to Hong Kong, that made a difference. Microsoft used to, for Microsoft, it was the piracy issue, right? They had sold something like 17,000, I think it was Windows 7, copies of Windows 7, and they received something like 17 million requests for updates from that. So they knew very well how much pirating was going on, and so they sort of went to the Chinese government and said, we can stand a certain amount of this stuff, but 10x is pretty rich, and the Chinese government made some adjustments, so it was worth them continuing to do that. So I just had this feeling, Steve, that the different experiences we have related to individual approaches. And frankly, each company told us that they were not willing to sort of get together and have the US government lead a unified approach to try to address common problems. They really didn't trust the US government to be able to carry it off and follow through and hang tough. They thought they were better off cutting their best deal.
Yeah, well, certainly in the case of General Motors, Starbucks, Disney, IBM, Apple, their analysis was correct. What the
Yeah.
Chinese, of course, say is they did a lot of market study. They built the relationships with the right people, and they succeeded. And the failures, with the exception of those who were entirely prevented from operating, are just based upon not having fully understood the market.
Yeah.
I don't agree with that entirely.
No, I don't either. I mean, what you know, it was that the Chinese government did not want that particular company gaining market share in that particular segment for a series of reasons: national security, the existence of a national champion, those reasons which were strictly Chinese reasons, not not neutral reasons.
I'll ask one last question, and then I'll go to the folks who have their hands up, which, Huawei has been the center of the technology dispute between the United States and China. You obviously run our Track 2 dialogue, and after that Track 2 dialogue in Sanya last December, a group of us from it went and visited Huawei, and they emphasized Huawei's willingness on 5G to license it in its entirety to an American company, to allow manufacturing to go to the United States, to allow the source code to be changed so Huawei couldn't even get into what they had licensed. What does it tell us about kind of Huawei and whether we should be trying to find some ways to cooperate?
Right. I mean, from the people I've talked to at Huawei and from the report I had from that visit, I mean, Huawei would prefer not to have that national security law, which has, made all Chinese communication companies suspect. I mean, that has been a huge crimp to their overseas activity, and I believe Chairman Ren when he says that when he would be asked to use his networks to serve Chinese government purposes, his first answer would be no. But his second answer, I don't think he could stand to stay on no. He wouldn't put his company out of business for that reason. And we have enough examples of the little ways that Huawei has gone along with acting in the interest of the Chinese government in its international bodies to prove that. So I think that the vulnerability of Huawei to Chinese government pressure is a real factor that has to be dealt with. But I do think that we should engage Huawei at a technical level on several initiatives. One are the Open Standards Initiative. They're known as ONAP and OTAN for those who follow the acronym game. It basically is trying to set up a set of interface standards in the core of a 5G network and at the outer edge at the cell towers and the computers that support those cell towers and so on. And there is an actual international consortium that's attempting to work out how you would do that. And if they were to succeed, then the entire 5G network, instead of being a turnkey operation from Huawei or Ericsson or Nokia, would be a completely different model, which would have individual components: a computer here, a server there, a cell tower there, a router there, a switch there. Their input and output would be defined, and many companies could compete for that piece of it. That would sort of break the primary fear of a company owning with proprietary software the entire critical infrastructure 5G network. Huawei is in the ONAP part of that consortium. The cell towers out. They are not in the OTAN part of it. But I think that's something to push with Huawei and other companies. And this can't be done at a policy basis. You have to get in there with the engineers and work out these interface standards. The offer that Chairman Ren made himself, I'll turn over the whole code to you, and it'll be run by a company under Huawei license, but it can all be done by Americans or Brits or Germans. I think we ought to take them up on it. I think the country that is best equipped to take them up on it right now is the UK with that Huawei cybersecurity research center. They have gone through the Huawei code. They know it well. They could reach a technical judgment on whether this could be run by a completely local subsidiary or not. So I think rather than slinging our talking points at each other, we ought to get the engineers together to explore these potential technical solutions and see if we can make a way that in which Huawei can not pose a security threat, but can provide equipment. Now, the whole area of subsidization of Huawei and national champion, we have other ways to deal with that. But I think we ought to break this problem up into the unfair practices piece, the technical risk piece, the national security piece, and work those one at a time on an international basis with Huawei, with ZTE, with Cisco, with others.
Yeah, yep. Given we're going to have no money left after all this COVID response, we'll need to find cheaper products while protecting our national security. And we know it's a lot cheaper than Ericsson and Nokia. Noah, let's try our new technology and promote the first person to ask a question. And if that doesn't work, I'll go to my next question. It's the first time we've done this, folks. So, okay, there's Nick Lardy.
I'm ready.
Go away.
My question for Denny is certainly one of the areas of technological competition now is the search for a vaccine for COVID-19 or coronavirus. My question is, what do you think would happen if the Chinese beat the Germans and the Brits and the US companies that are also working for a vaccine? How do you think they would share it or keep it to themselves? This would be an area for potential cooperation. It could also be an area for potential conflict. So it's a completely hypothetical question, but based on your understanding of how the Chinese work these issues, what do you think the outcome would be?
Boy, I think that would be a 51-49er within the Politburo, Nick. Certainly the old, there would be a strong faction that says, keep it for ourselves. It's a competitive advantage. Let the virus rage through the economies and populations of our competitors, and we'll come out better on the end. There'd be another faction that said, listen, this would be the greatest contribution to Chinese soft power that we could possibly make, and we ought to take full advantage of it. And I bet it would be a big debate. And if I had to bet money on, red or black, which one of those would come out in a medical area at this point after what China's gone through, I bet they would share.
Yeah, I think even if it gets invented in the United States or in Europe, we will likely need Chinese manufacturing capability to distribute to the rest of the world. So we certainly, in my view, that's one of the reasons we need a more cooperative relationship with China. Noah, who's next? The Nelson Dong, who's one of our directors from Dorothy and Whitney, he asks, how serious is the hazard of Chinese efforts to recruit scientific, medical, and engineering talent from U.S. research universities through its various talent programs? And how can the U.S. defend against such efforts without invidious profiling of Chinese American scholars in higher education?
Yeah, that's of course a real hot issue now, an important question that Nelson is asking. If you look at the extremes of it, if a bright Chinese citizen comes to the United States, studies at one of our universities, acts in an exemplary manner, goes to work for an American company, decides after a while that he or she wants to go back to China to work in his own country, great. That's that's fine. I think that the only thing that the United States can object to are clandestine activities, either by Chinese or by Americans who are working there, hiding relationships with Chinese companies and Chinese universities, hiding affiliations. And I think it's that attempt to do things secretly that justifies the sort of investigations that the FBI and other agencies are undertaking. And of course, everyone that turns out to be a questionnaire that was filled out improperly, a connection that was hidden, becomes a big anecdotal hit to the others who are trying to just join the internationally minded scientific community, which has been a benefit to the planet. So as long as there are Chinese or Americans who attempt to cover things up, and or as long as there is a Chinese government that tries to slip PLA officers into universities without revealing their connections and so on, then the pretty inevitable result is going to be that a lot of suspicion, tighter regulations, more vetting, more visas being refused, all of that. So I think that we simply have to try to concentrate our efforts on what is in fact illegal and wrong and secret, and try to give those who are legitimate the opportunity to operate openly and honestly, and let the chips fall where they may. I mean, I certainly the United States should be able to compete and bring in bright Chinese talented people to continue to work in the U.S. for a long time and contribute most of their efforts to American companies. That's certainly the case now, and we should be able to continue it. So I'd say that we have to follow the rules. We have to be very careful with the statements that high-level officials make, and sort of treat it the way, you know, I guess the first real test we had it in this area was after 9/11 with the anti-Arab sentiment, which could have, I think, spiraled out of control. And there were a few ugly incidents, but I thought leadership, President Bush, right on down, recognizing that could be a problem, was very careful in the distinctions that he made and the way that he talked, and the actions of the government sort of fell in with that, and not every Arab was condemned, and eventually things came back to a more normal peace. So I think it's a case of the way the United States treats it by pursuing what are legitimate concerns and requests, even if they are onerous, and then the attitude that's taken publicly in terms of emphasizing that the problems are in a minority. The overall process is an advantage to the United States.
You would support stapling a green card to folks who get PhDs in the United States?
Oh yeah. I mean, what's America's secret sauce? We steal the best people from other countries. That's what we do. Let's continue with it.
Sarah Kemp from Merck asks, what is the role, opportunity for collaboration in the healthcare sector, given the recent Chinese advances in AI, healthcare, and the COVID-19 crisis? What collaborative role could the U.S. and China play in that space?
You'd like to say that would be facilitated by the WHO, but I think that's pretty much damaged goods for a while here. So I think that most of the collaboration is going to have to be at a lower level, university to university, company to company, perhaps government institution to government institution. And I just think we need to look for some. We need to look for some wins, however modest, rather than trying to go for home runs at this point. So as we discussed before, wouldn't it be wonderful to say, okay, everybody messed it up back in February, but let's try to get some of our best people together now at this point to share research on coronavirus. Wouldn't it be nice to pick out a couple of areas that seem to be ripe for medical progress that both sides could contribute to, that aren't as sensitive as some of the others, and try to foster a few successes there. I think in this period, that's about the best we can do, rather than trying to go for something big like a WHO-led effort, or something that would be signed at a President Xi, President Trump summit. I just don't see that going on. I think we have to think small for a while here.
Yeah. John Holden, former president of the committee. Back to the IP questions. Court judgments in China for IP violations are often not enforced at the local level. How then could bilateral US-China understanding be designed to ensure that China is held responsible for the enforcement of its own court decisions?
Yeah, I've heard the same sort of mixed stories. I have heard some local governments that do enforce judgments won by U.S. companies. They tend to be, the ones that I've heard of at least, are in the relatively simple area of counterfeiting and patent infringement, rather than deep issues of IP theft and so on. So I think there are some successes, as well as notable cases of what John points to, and what I think we have very little control in the Chinese market, except for using reciprocity. That we should look at what Chinese firms are doing in the United States, and we should only offer new protection for Chinese companies in return for Chinese government and regulators enforcing their own laws, and enforcing them all the way through to collecting damages, rather than simply giving verdicts that are not carried out. So I think the main leverage we have is the way we treat Chinese companies here, and that's probably what we should use. And we probably should do a few, rather than just reach an agreement, sign pieces of paper, and walk away.
But you mean that would be for a state-owned company? In other words, you have a lot of private companies operating in the United States, private Chinese companies. To punish them for the Chinese government's failure to enforce an IP decision would be problematic.
Well, I think there's a range. There's a range of issues, Steve, that don't walk back what law-abiding, contributing Chinese companies are doing in their current sphere of operations. But if they ask for something new, something different, something additional, seems to me that's where you say, well, okay, we can consider that, but we would like to have some of the basics taken care of in China first. So you don't punish them for following the rules and doing what they're doing now, but in terms of extending, having them go to acquiring additional American companies, and so on, you hold them hostage for new things in return for China just doing the basics in its own country.
We, of course, had an interesting experience on reciprocity in the last couple of months where our government decided to expel about 50 Chinese journalists who were working for state-owned media. Understand on the theory that we have very limited numbers of journalists in China, and they're harshly restricted. That, of course, then resulted in the reciprocal expulsion of New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and Time Magazine, Voice of America, a whole bunch of other people. So you get kind of in this race to the bottom, which is, is that good?
No, it's not. It's not good. But I think we have to be a little bit clever in these things. My experience with Chinese is if you talk a lot and do little things, you are setting yourself up for this sort of thing. If you talk a little and do big things, and let the actions speak for them, don't make it a matter of a public tit for tat face, then you can have better results. So, we could have gotten rid of 60 phony CCTV or whatever it is, journalists using a little bit of time, a little bit of subtlety, and made it more difficult for China to publicly do something it wanted to do anyhow, and which it was doing, in fact, anyhow. So, the skill with which you do these things does matter as well as what you do.
Yeah. I mean, we need to find carrots. Sticks are sometimes, the greatest carrot, and a lot of what, and you talked about it in your 4 points, was multilateralism. That if you do a unilateral action, well, then China just goes to somebody else and does it. So if we restrict investment, we restrict technology, and that technology exists in South Korea, Japan, or the EU, then they just go there. So kind of, the single best multilateral approach would have been if we had signed on to TPP. Then there would have been this enormous carrot for China to reform in order to meet the standards of TPP, or else they would have suffered from enormous trade diversion and investment diversion. So all the members of TPP would have cooperated, and until China met the standards, it would have been left out, which would have been a kind of part carrot, part stick, but mostly carrot.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. But I think if you look back a little bit further, most of the US-China economic relationship has been lots of carrots and very few sticks in terms of opening the US market and so on.
Well, the U.S. market we are an open, for better or worse, we have been an open market. So the question should we try and put in place the way our president has now, put in place differential tariffs against Chinese goods and try and create a trade diversion. So the tariffs on Chinese goods has forced some exporters in China to move to Vietnam, to move to Malaysia, to move to Sri Lanka, to move elsewhere. I think it's costs poor Americans a lot.
Yeah, I mean, tariffs is an awfully blunt weapon. I would much prefer to look at individual areas, whether they be IP property theft, subsidization of state-owned enterprises, and so on, and try to deal with those individually and keep score individually and use reciprocity and consistency. I guess that's sort of what those subgroups under the tariff negotiations were trying to do, but it's hard to do all of that at one time and get it all wrapped up. So So yeah, I mean, you're right. A combination of carrots and sticks is always effective. We have to have skillful U.S. government personnel doing it, talking closely with business. U.S. trade representatives, I think, do a pretty good job of that in general, have over the years, and get back on that track.
Yeah. Here's a question from Jonathan Wurtzel at McKinsey. Would you encourage U.S. corporations to engage with Chinese companies and government to contribute to global public health and COVID-19 responses outside China? If so, what risks should they be aware of? Could the National Committee play a role in this regard, he adds?
I mean, I think so. I always found, and my experience is not so much with pandemics as with responding to typhoons and tsunamis and natural disasters. I always found when the relief organizations arrive on the scene, whether they be private or whether they be government, pretty quickly they get themselves organized so each contributes as it can, and the mission really takes over. Usually, it seems, in my experience, you don't get the political spin of who gets the credit and who did more than the other and who was churlish about it until you get back to capitals. So I think that we know this next wave of COVID-19 is heading to Africa and some of the poorer countries of the world, and the United States and China and European advanced countries should show up. And I think the best thing we can do is give the organizations at the scene permission to cooperate with each other in the way that seems most effective. I think I just don't think there are risks like tech transfer risks or risks of national security involved in those scenarios. That those are pretty straightforward operations of trying to take care of sick people, provide basic supplies, and it's hard for me to see that there's any downside to cooperation, and you save lives with upside. But then it's sort of up to each national capital to say how much it's going to claim credit for what was done there, rather than saying that the team worked well and everybody contributed and we're glad we saved lives. And my experience is, you can't control that, and you also, numerous people can win. I guess the biggest example of that I've seen of disaster relief response to something like a pandemic making in geopolitical terms was when Aceh was hit by the tsunami in what was that, 2000, right around New Year's Day of 2003, and big international relief effort, and the international relief effort basically so overwhelmed well, it was really a civil war, an insurgency going on in that country, that once things came back on their feet, the Aceh civil strife ended, much to the relief of the poor inhabitants who were caught in the middle. So I think international cooperation is good, has good results, has many successes, few villains in it. And so I would say that joint responses to help other countries based on the really tough lessons that we are learning in the United States and that China has learned would be a good thing. Yeah,
certainly PACOM, your old command, plays an enormous role in that assistance.
And it's always good. It's always good. I can't think of one that that turned out that we thought, oh, we shouldn't have done that, because China made a gain at our expense, or so on. It's human, it's genuine, and it's good.
Yeah. Mark Buckman from the National War College asks, I heard a China scholar opine that it didn't matter if China built out the world's 5G infrastructure, because within a few years, the software making use of 5G technology would be more important than the infrastructure. And the United States would surely dominate the software that will make 5G run. Do you think America can be sanguine about who builds the 5G infrastructure?
Well, the trouble is that under current 5G software design, Huawei in fact does own the code that runs the network, and the Huawei, using direct access, updates it, fixes glitches, puts in new releases of software. So it simply has not been true with past generations of wire infrastructure that it becomes sort of there's no Linux of the software that runs wireless infrastructures. It is in fact owned and maintained by individual companies, and it would take a policy or a business change for that to stop being Huawei software. So that's why I said if we can go to these open standards, ONAP and OTAN, then we would get closer to that case of many different companies could own parts of the network. They would be inherently less susceptible to national security exploitation, more business. So if that open architecture gets us to non-proprietary software, then I would be all for it.
Which gets to exactly what we were talking about earlier, the licensing and the manufacturing in the United States.
And open sourcing, yeah.
Derek Yan at Crane Shares asks, kind of the other end of the question, how can U.S. companies benefit from China's technology rise?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's not out of the question, circumstances change, that if Chinese companies acted like big international companies, and when they went into another country, considered licensing arrangements as well as sole source subsidiaries that would run everything, considered cooperative measures. They areas in which Chinese technology was superior for a certain function could be used, could make money for that Chinese company and benefit the country concerned. The main area that I know right now in which big advanced U.S. companies and Chinese companies do in fact cooperate together is in the energy sector. There are in fact joint oil fields, gas fields, in which the Chevrons and the Texacos and the CNOOCs and the bring their own technology, and they split up who does what, and they know that one company is particularly good on seismic exploration. The other is good at the pipeline side of it. They divide it up. They figured out the interfaces, and they can all make money. They can all bring pretty advanced technology to cooperate, and they all have learned how to do that without stealing from each other, knowing that they can cooperate again in another field. And if we could reach that sort of an arrangement in in other sectors in which the technology is not. I mean, the technology is pretty sophisticated in these oil companies, and they do work together. So I think there is a model there. There may be others in which you could imagine a Chinese company playing a role. I mean, I'm waiting for the next the real next Deng Xiaoping to come and say, listen, the advantages of China is big enough to play by the international rules that perhaps China was not instrumental in making back in the beginning, but Chinese companies and China itself has much more to gain by just unleashing Chinese commercial and entrepreneurial skills and playing in the world on a fair basis than it does by trying to take use of its advantage to make these relatively small gains for China. I mean, having a 99-year lease on a useless piece of real estate in southern Sri Lanka, and playing games in this little desert patch in Djibouti. I mean, this is minor league stuff, compared to what China could get if its international companies had the reputation of being cooperative and industry leaders and did not raise these suspicions of getting these tiny intelligence gains and jeopardizing their country. And I guess I'm looking for the Chinese leader who sort of has this mental breakthrough, saying that China is big enough and powerful enough that it can play according to the rest of the world's rules, primarily, that it can benefit from that system, and some it'll win, some it'll lose, but by and large it'll be prosperous and respected. And if Chinese leaders can just make that breakthrough rather than saying, well, we have to do everything we can to favor our companies and then use them for our other two-bit espionage and national security purposes, because after all, everybody works for the party. If China can get over that mindset and change to a more expansive mindset, then God bless them. That would be good.
I think it's funny. It's hard to find good news these days, but I think the good news is there are people in the Chinese leadership who agree with you. We would not have seen the reforms proposed in the third plenum of the 18th Party Congress. So now,
right.
7 years ago, we would not have seen those reforms proposed unless there were people who agreed with us, agreed with what you just said. So what has happened is that part of the Chinese government, that part of the party is, as happens frequently in China currently, not really in power. And that those reforms, probably are 5 to 10% enacted and 90% not enacted. But the good news in that bad news story is somebody chose to write what is a highly vetted party document that got put out and ultimately not really implemented. But obviously there were people who believed in that. So I think that's the good news in the bad news.
I think you're right, Steve, but I don't think that, I think we go too far if we think, well, what we have to do is do things from the United States that will support the good guys and hurt the bad guys. I mean, I think it overestimates our influence to think that that if, for example, we make concessions on something, that will somehow strengthen those who do it. I think we have to fight our corner in the near term with the kinds of things that I made in my recommendations. Whether China takes a huge turn in one direction or another is going to be determined by the internal power struggles within China. And as most of us have been saying for years, we probably can ensure that we can probably help the bad guys win by doing certain things, but we probably cannot make the good guys win by doing things. So I think the approach that most of us have taken is not give the bad guys additional arguments to say, see, we were right. We're just going to be tougher and meaner and more illegal, but just fight our corner and insist on when we have interests and when we have things that are important to us, we're going to support them with a combination of carrots and sticks, and then watch to see how whether those people who wrote the what came out of the 13th session
18th,
come out on top. So I guess that's where
that's
where I am. I mean, it's the old Marxian dilemma, right? If you think that the history is going a certain direction, you just lie down under a tree and wait for it to get there, right? And no, you got to fight it. You got to
absolutely
keep it on track.
We're way over time, Denny. So let me just, because I've got a former PACOM commander, I can't, and the newspaper today was full of kind of discussions of the South China Sea, and you mentioned energy. So let me just close with a question about that, which, this one was with the Malaysians, and the Chinese sent a Coast Guard vessel and a seismic survey vessel to tail a Petronas seismic survey vessel, which was in disputed areas about 200 nautical miles off the coast of Malaysia. So likely within the EEZ of Malaysia. So number one, what should we do there? Number two, when you talk about energy, I've always harbored the fantasy that we should put all these disputes aside. That, once upon a time, of course, now with the price of oil, it really doesn't matter. You don't want to be drilling for expensive oil in the South China Sea. But assuming the price comes back, that the Chevrons, the Exxons work with the Chinese, work with CNOOC, work with Petronas, work with the Vietnamese and the Philippines to jointly develop those areas and share the benefits. Is that a potential solution, or is that just my
I think that's
old fantasy?
No, I think that's a potential solution. As you know, even around the Senkakus, Diaoyus, Japan and China were, before the 2012 incident, they were pretty close to agreeing on a shared revenue and explicitly saying that this made no difference in their respective sovereignty claims, but they were going to drill it and share the revenues 50-50, and that might well have happened had it not been for that incident in 2012. There are arrangements like that way down at where the South China Sea and the Gulf of Thailand come together, and Malaysia, Thailand, in a disputed area is handled that way. No change in sovereignty claims, but a 50-50 split on oil revenue. So the precedent is out there, and it'd be wonderful if any of the claimants in the South China Sea could reach the same sort of thing. Because until that happens, nobody's going to benefit at any price from either natural gas, of which there's more of, or oil, which there's probably a little bit less of, although we don't know because the exploration haven't been done. So that is the right thing to do over the long term. In the near term, I think this is sort of one more like the Chinese rig that went down and drilled in for a little while in Vietnamese disputed waters. You do it, you go away, you log it, and this incident will be overtaken and just be part of the history the way that one was. I think the significant thing is that it really is a shift in Chinese behavior towards Malaysia from the past, when it basically was wooing Malaysia with big economic credits and economic inducements, Silk Belt and Road Initiative projects, and so on, and to take this sharper edged approach towards Malaysia, which I think it was trying to sort of move out of the idea of an anti-Chinese coalition among the other claimants, is just going to harden opposition to China. And I think that Malaysia will run through the usual round of techniques that have been developed to deal with this thing. It'll leave a sour taste in Malaysia and make them even less willing to take the Chinese side on some of these disputes.
Your former command sent 3 ships down there to kind of show the Chinese we're still going to sail wherever we're free to sail. Do you worry about an incident? And that's my last question, then I'll let you go.
Yeah, no, I don't worry about an incident. And if there is an incident, they're pretty containable at sea, since they're all official. It's so interesting. The Chinese are basically thinks like soldiers, not sailors. You don't own water in peacetime. You go out and do something, and then you have to leave, or a typhoon comes through and you have to leave. Whereas the Chinese sort of they have this image that you can put a fence and troops in the blue part of the map, just the way you can the green part of the map. So they'll be down there for a while chasing around, and then they've got to leave because they need to go back to get fixed or something, and the situation will change. So it's a big ocean down there. When you go 20 miles from somebody, you don't see them anymore. So I think this will pass.
Well, there's some reassurance in a time when there's not much to be reassured. But Denny, thank you so much for doing this. Thank you so much for kicking off our series, Navigating China's Technological Rise. Our next program, as I said at the beginning, will be May 8th with Anya Manuel and Paul Triolo. And Denny, as always, I can't thank you enough for a highly informative, interesting, and fun discussion.
Good to be with you, Steve, and everybody else there. Thank you.
Thanks.